It's a shorthand way of talking about an entire demographic upheaval that lasted for 20 years. The birth rate in the country had declined steadily for nearly 200 years. Then all of a sudden, starting in the early 1940s, reversed and went up and stayed up. Stayed up until the mid-60s, stayed up for a good 20 years. And the marriage age, which had been going down, went down further and faster, so that people were really marrying young in the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s. It stayed that way. The marriage rate went way up. For the first time, almost everybody married, and married young. And this cut across, all of these statistics cut across the entire socioeconomic, racial, ethnic ladder, everything. Now, you had different groups with different birth rates, but they all followed the same pattern. If it started out high, it went higher. If it started out low, it followed the same curve. Virtually everybody was participating in this massive demographic revolution that lasted 20 years, up until the mid-60s. And then it changed. And on some level, and this is one of the things that we forget about the 60s, that I think requires us to take a long, hard, good historical view, which is that those who would argue that the 60s marked the end of the good old days, the end of family stability, the end of everything being predictable and comfortable, and that was when divorce went up, and that's when people started to question family life and all of those kinds of things, and that's when sexuality ran amok. I mean, there are certain ways you can look at those indicators, but on the most basic level, what I think is important to understand is that the children of the 60s, baby boom children growing up, in some ways behaved a whole lot more like their grandparents than they behaved like their parents. So if we take the long view, what do we see happening in their grandparents' lives? Well, the grandparents grew up in the early decades of the 20th century. What happened then? Massive consumer revolution, a massive sexual revolution. The incidence, if we just want to look at premarital sexual intercourse, which is a very bad indicator of sexual activity, but the one that everyone is obsessed with. So if we want to just look at that, there have really been only 2 times in the last century that particular sexual behavior increased dramatically. One time was in the early 20th century, and the second time was in the 60s. So you have the children then, the grandchildren, behaving in a lot of ways like their grandparents. The divorce rate went up in both eras. Both eras were marked by an explosion of popular culture, new forms of public amusements, especially a powerful youth culture. So somehow the generation in between is what is really strange, and somehow in our popular consciousness we have dubbed them the normal, the traditional. There was nothing traditional about them. They were very bizarre and unusual by historical standards. So one way to look at the 60s is to say, well, the children of the 60s just went right back to the way their grandparents were and picked up and went ahead from there. So on some level, what happened in the 60s wasn't so dramatic. What were the pieces that were new? Well, if we want to look at degree, we could say, well, the divorce rate had increased dramatically in the early 20th century, leveled off in the 50s. In fact, it even went down. That was a very, very striking thing to happen. This sense of family solidarity was so powerful that the divorce rate, which had been going up forever, I mean, there was no, with the exception of the 30s for economic reasons, the divorce rate had really steadily increased. It suddenly flattens a little. Certainly, as far as I'm concerned, it had nothing to do with people being more happily married. It wasn't about that. But it was about some kind of a commitment to that stable family unit. So what happens in the late 60s, of course, is a skyrocketing of the divorce rate that was unprecedented. Another thing that happens is a change in people's sexual behavior outside of marriage. An increase that was marked, and an increase in accepting attitudes about sexual behavior. But what's curious is that the opinion polls at the time show that people's behavior was changing faster than their attitudes. So that you would have college students, even in the early 70s, asked whether they had engaged in premarital sex. Again, a misnomer because it assumes it was premarital. Who was to say whether it was premarital or just sex outside of marriage? So all of these terms, I think, are very loaded. But anyway, if they were asked whether they had done it, the vast majority said they had. If they were asked whether they approved of it, the vast majority of the very same group said they disapproved. So I guess the psychologists would call it cognitive dissonance. I would call it guilt. There was a very high guilt quotient going on in the midst of what was perceived as a sexual revolution. Nonetheless, those attitudes did eventually change to indicate a much greater acceptance of particular kinds of sexual activity. Certainly, sexual behavior changed. Marriage behavior changed. You started to get men and women waiting longer before they got married, waiting longer before they had children, having fewer children. The birth rate went way down. We went from the baby boom to the baby bust. But I think on some level you can also exaggerate the meaning of those changes. Certainly in terms of sexual behavior, if all we're looking at is rates of intercourse, I think we're missing a lot about changing sexual behavior that went on in the decades before, because certainly during the 40s and 50s, during the time that these, the parents of the baby boomers were young adolescents and young married people, there was a sexual revolution going on there too, but it was focused on marriage. It was focused on a certain kind of sexual brinkmanship, you might say, to use a Cold War metaphor, of a lot of sexual play allegedly holding the line until marriage. Well, Kinsey blew all of that out of the water in the late 40s and early 50s by showing just how far Americans were in their behavior from their stated beliefs about sexuality. So suddenly when you have anti-communists screaming about the potential danger of homosexuals as security risks, suddenly Kinsey comes out and says, gosh, homosexuality is really a part of mainstream experience in ways that no one had ever dared to say before. And so you really do have this enormous recognition suddenly in the late 40s and 50s about what a kind of sexually diverse nation we were. So if we look to the 60s and say, well, here's a sexual revolution breaking away from this repression, repression was an effort